Hello, welcome to Postcolonial Space. I'm Masood Raja, and thank you so much for joining me today. This is yet another webinar in our series on postcolonial studies. And those of you who are joining us for the first time, we do this every Saturday, 10 a.m. US Daylight Time in Texas, which is 8 p.m. Pakistan Standard Time, and then rest of the times you can figure out yourself. So today's topic is post-colonial diaspora literature, which one of the subscribers and supporters of our channel had requested. And so I thought we should have a conversation about that. We first need to understand what do we mean by diaspora. Now, I do have a general video on diaspora itself as a post-colonialism concept, which you can watch in your own time in my post-colonial concepts playlist. But generally speaking, diaspora as a term comes originally from Greece. And in that sense, what it meant was that when people from Greek city-states, when they captured new territory, the population that was, literally it means to scatter. So the population that would leave a certain city-state and go and settle on the new conquered territories was called the diaspora population. Eventually, as the Bible is translated into Greek, especially the Old Testament, then the term diaspora very strongly gets associated with the Jewish diaspora, the eviction of the Jewish people from the Levant. And hence, whenever in literary studies or cultural studies, diaspora is written with a capital D or an uppercase D, it means the Jewish diaspora. Now, the interesting part of the scattering or the Jewish diaspora, which a lot of scholars miss, is that the second important diaspora of the Jews was when they went and settled in Andalusia, the Muslim Spain, right? And that a lot of Jewish scholars consider that as one of the golden ages of Jewish diaspora. And it's something that a lot of Muslim and Jewish scholars forget because we are so busy talking about the irreconcilable differences. We forget that we have hundreds of years of history together, having worked together, and then being expelled together from Spain after the Reconquista. So overall, generally, the term itself means a scattering. It can be forceful removal of people, and now in the contemporary sense, it can also be voluntary movement from one place to another. So if you look at the largest diaspora in the world right now is the Indian diaspora, the number of people living outside of India who claim an Indian heritage. Then the Mexican diaspora in United States, Canada, and North America. Similarly, recently, the refugee crisis in Syria has then launched what we could term the Syrian diaspora. And then, of course, the African diaspora is one of the largest diasporas, not simply because of the slave trade and forceful removal of people through the slave trade, but also post-independence diasporas from African nations to the former colonial centers. And then in the United States, you can also talk about the Caribbean diaspora. And these were all and still are deeply dynamic communities. I mean, if you look at the Harlem Renaissance, a lot of the big scholars of it came from the Caribbean, right? Or had a dual identity. Similarly, in the American literary production, then quite a few of major and prominent authors are from diaspora communities. So when we come to defining diaspora literature, right, within the post-colonial concept, it would then be literature associated with one or the other diaspora community, right? An author, let's say, Indian American author or Indian British author would be part of that diaspora community. And then the topics that they invoke would depend on maybe the migration experience, the generational experience in the adopted country, or themes and politics and issues related to what they still might consider their home country. Okay. So depending on which diaspora it is, where they are located, first of all, they need to have an idea of community, right? They need to have a sort of cultural and political identity, so that would require numbers, right? And then the literature so produced needs to deal with probably at least the issues of the home country or the native country, or the experience of individuals and members of the community within the metropolitan cultures where they have settled. And that's the, roughly speaking, how we define diaspora literature. Now, quite a few scholars, of course, have theorized on it, have written about it. And one such scholar who comes to my mind, and that is the diaspora communities as political communities, is Benedict Anderson, right, who you all probably already know is famous for his book on nationalism, Imagined Communities, right? But he also contributed an essay to a collection of essays on cosmopolitanism edited by Bruce Robbins. And in that, what he's talking about is mostly the British diaspora communities, but also American. And what he realized through his research is that a lot of these diaspora communities in their political alignment back home tend to support deeply conservative political parties. And that kind of bears out. So if you look at the Jewish diaspora population in the United States, other than the progressive young Jewish activists and scholars, majority of the Jewish diaspora is still supporting, right, the divisive policies of Benjamin Netanyahu and others. So they are supporting kind of right-leaning politics. Similarly, if you look at the Indian diaspora in the United States, those who are prominent in their communities, you will find that majority of them are nationalistic, and they support Hindu nationalist parties. And same is the case if you look at the British diaspora, like Pakistani diaspora, they tend to also, not like as a large group, but tend to support either the dictators, right, or the conservative political parties. So this is the kind of Benedict Anderson's reading of it. Now, another thing to keep in mind, and I'll get to the questions in a minute, Mudassar, to keep in mind is that diaspora also has a generational aspect to it. Okay, so if you look at the British diaspora, and it comes across really clearly in Hanif Qureshi's books. He has a short story called My Son the Fanatic, or even the novel Buddha of Suburbia. So the first major wave of Indian and Pakistani diaspora to United Kingdom, was in 1950s, and even before that in Manchester and others, but 1950s and 60s. And these were the people who came in and they kind of assimilated and adopted the British culture and its habits. But when the second generation emerges and they grow up within the same culture and come up against the metropolitan racism, right? And because of the disillusionment and poverty, and also because of the active recruitment by the religious organizations, the second generation, by and large, tend to be more conservative and become judgmental of their own parents. Now, there could be non-religious reasons too, because post-1970s and 80s, people start taking pride in their ethnic identity and don't want to do that kind of cultural living in which you're obsequious to the host country. So all of these things play a huge role in it. Now, the literature that comes out of it then represents those anxieties, right? Deals with those kind of politics of race, politics of exclusion. You can see that even in the most elite authors, right? I mean, if you look at the entire oeuvre of Salman Rushdie, right? What is it if not diaspora literature? Like any aspects of the London life, even in the most controversial of his books, Satanic Verses, right? The chapters set in London absolutely deal with what happens to immigrants. Can they actually become British, or would they always remain Indian, right? And those are the issues that come across there. So I'm not necessarily saying that the diaspora literature is reflectionist, that they absolutely must reflect the life they are living, but these are the issues that they deal with. Now, why do we include them in post-colonial literature? That's a very interesting question. My understanding of it simply is that post-colonial literature or field of study is theoretically the most eclectic. We pick up whatever we can use, right? And similarly, in terms of literature, instead of excluding these writers from Africa, from the Caribbean, like, people like Michelle Cliff, Ngugi Thiong'o, who's originally from Kenya but has taught in the United States, why exclude them? I mean, these are the people who are dealing with the issues of post-colonies, but also dealing with issues of populations that came to the metropolitan, right? And post-colonialism, as an expansive field, subfield of English studies, can very easily deal with it and handle those issues. So these are some of my thoughts about the topic, and I see I have a couple of questions. Mudassir, let's go to your question. Why do diaspora writers need to look back to their native countries while living in host countries for ages? Good question. Why do they? I mean, the one part is that it doesn't matter how long they have lived in America or Canada. Identity, you carry it with you, right? So if Masood Raja has been here for 25 years, there is no way in the dominant American culture that I can just simply pass as American. I will always have a hyphen attached to me. That's the one reason, the apparent reason that your identity is constantly split. Two, of course, I mean, when you live away from a primary culture, even if you're second generation, right, there is this other place in the world where your parents came from. And maybe there is some kind of curiosity and longing. I see it as a positive thing. Because, I mean, if the same people forget about it, if Masood Raja forgets about Pakistan and starts going about saying, I'm an American, obviously all of you will start hating me too. So because you're like, oh, he forgot about his own country. So it's kind of a precarious situation, but I think partly it's a nostalgic return. Partly it's a return to, bolster your identity. I mean, if you look at the worst case of deracination in America, that is the African American people, right? Because the connection to Africa was so deeply severed that there was no material connection to Africa, right? But still, if you look at the 70s and 80s, the movement from the authors was of retrieval, right? We lost this history. Our ancestors were removed forcefully from Africa. Can we trace it, right? Because it's a question of origins. Where did we come from? You're not necessarily trying to become African, but what you're saying is that cultural history is part of my identity. I need to know it. Now, the dominant groups in any culture don't need that, because the dominant history, the dominant culture, it already is over-determined by the dominant narratives, right? So the Caucasian Americans, maybe sometimes the Irish Americans will go to their history, Italian Americans, and those are diasporic communities too. But if you are in a minority and also a powerless situation, this return to the place of origins has personal value because it gives more to you about your own history. And collectively, in terms of a cultural politics, it gives you something to bolster your identity. And in either case, I don't see it as something that they have no right to or something that they shouldn't be doing. I mean, I think it's a good thing that people try to locate where they came from or where their parents came from. Okay, let's go to Naveed's question. Is the diaspora support for conservatives in their native countries because of an existential crisis, since they aren't completely accepted in the West and thus have a kind of ethnic void, I would be hesitant to like give a definitive answer to that. I think part of it is probably that they are not fully accepted here, but probably also that the religious identities and ethnic identities kind of get hardened, in diaspora communities. So if you are, let's say, I look at the Pakistani diaspora community in the Dallas area. We have one of the largest communities. So is India. So when I look at them, I realize that they are not a monolithic group, right? But what has started happening is that everyone is now divided, first of all, region-wise. So Punjabis are on one side, people from Karachi and Hyderabad on another. Not that they are like belligerent communities, but they tend to form micro-communities. And then they are divided along political lines. There are like staunch PMLN supporters, and then there are staunch PTI supporters, staunch supporters of Pervez Musharraf, right? And they talk to each other, but those are their divisions. And I think part of it is because they are here in a larger metropolitan area and they are looking for smaller identity, cultural identity structures where they feel comfortable, where they have alignments with others. But also there is a material advantage to that. I've noticed that quite a few people, they will make their own little group, and that enables them to invite people, powerful people from Pakistan, right, and develop connections with them with the hope that eventually they probably will have some political influence. Then they start supporting organizations in their own home country to also have a little more political influence. So all of these things come together in forming those kind of. So if you believe in a religious identity strictly or an ethnic identity which is connected to religion, then you will tend to support anyone in back home who is protecting the interests of that community. And I think that is what forces a lot of these communities or sub-communities to support conservative causes. But also, yes, the anxieties of living in a dominant metropolitan culture. In case of Britain, if you've read Hanif Qureshi's novel, the young people tend to be converted is because of the disillusionment, the material disillusionment. There are no jobs, no acceptance, and then active engagement through the mosques and through the people who try to tell them, come to us, and become a good Muslim and you'll have a place in the world. So there are those ideological reasons as well. And no, keep in mind, this doesn't apply to everyone. There are always exceptions. And okay, so these are some of the questions so far. Now, in terms of literary production, it varies, right? I mean, I had a conversation with someone who had written an article and kind of misquoted me. And when we went back and forth in the emails, he was telling me, so and so, I interviewed him. He doesn't even consider himself a Pakistani author, right? And my point was, it doesn't really matter whether you consider yourself a Pakistani author or not. Of course, I didn't send it to that person because I didn't want to get involved in this spat with a person who had completely misread me and misquoted me. Because if you are from Pakistan, living in London, using Pakistani raw materials to write your stories and proffer them to a metropolitan audience, right? It doesn't matter how British you are. You will always be a Pakistani British author, okay? Because that's the raw materials you're dealing with. People will expect you to tell the stories from Pakistan. Look at Salman Rushdie's most successful novels, right? It's obviously not the one he wrote about Hollywood. All the successful novels are grounded in India or Pakistan or the Muslim world or the Muslim history, because there is a certain expectation in the metropolitan market. So we are talking, that thing that I told about the author was Mohsin Hamid, right? That he claims he doesn't even claim to be a Pakistani author. So then another point is, if you look at the Granta's special issue on Pakistani fiction, if he doesn't consider himself a Pakistani author, why did he contribute an essay to it? Why didn't he turn around and tell the editors, hey, I don't consider myself a Pakistani author? You can't have it both ways. So that's the problem of the diaspora, is because your identity, even if you've lived here, even if you're second generation, there is a designation assigned to you, right? And then if you're doing work, literary work, and drawing on the raw materials of the native country or the experience of immigration itself, in one way or the other, you are writing the experience of the diasporic community. And that means that you are caught within the politics and culture of diaspora, right? And there is no escape from it. Okay, so any other questions, or I'm trying to refresh the comments and see if there are any other questions, but so far there are none. Now, while you come up with any other questions, in terms of post-colonial studies, when I design a course, or even when I create a list for my PhD students, we don't necessarily have this distinction, oh, you should read these many diaspora authors. Actually, it doesn't even cross my mind. All I am interested in is to have a representative list of works from pretty much all the former colonial parts of the world. And that kind of takes us to a different bag of troubles. I remember once one of my candidates was defending her dissertation or her exams, and one of the committee members kept asking her to defend the field, post-colonial studies itself, which I thought was unfair, but I had to intervene there, because to this person, a field, the problem she saw was, why are there texts from Africa and the Caribbean and South Asia on your list? Because this person was a scholar on one author, right? And 100 years of British history. And this person could not conceive that a list can be so expansive, right? And obviously there was no time there to help that person get rid of that prejudice, which I consider a prejudice. So, I mean, one aspect of post-colonial studies, like expansive as it is that usually we don't make that distinction that you'll have native authors and diaspora authors. Because for as long as they're dealing with either the experience of dislocation, right, whether enforced or voluntary, or the experience of native countries, for us, it is post-colonial studies. There was another question that emerges in the Pakistani reception of Pakistani writing in English. I was once giving a conference paper, and a student asked me this question, and the question was, how can these people who live in England and New York and California, how can they know Pakistan well enough to write about it? And I wrote an article about it too, because there is a basic assumption there that in order to understand Pakistan, you have to live there, one, good, and two, that people who live in Pakistan understand Pakistan. And my point was that your understanding of Pakistan might be experiential in the neighborhood where you live. My question to that student was, do you know where Khaplu is? And do you know who the queen of Khaplu was? And she was like, no. And I was like, you lived in Pakistan all your life. Khaplu is in Skardu, and the queen of Khaplu used to be the queen of Khaplu under the Kashmir rule. But you living in Pakistan do not know that. But if you want to write about her, you'll have to go and do your research. So similarly, anyone who wants to write about Pakistan and tell the stories, they can live in Pakistan and learn through experience, know the languages, at least one or two, and then every writing, knowing a culture is mostly textual, right? You go, you read about it, you do your research, who has written what. After having lived most of my early life in Pakistan, I'm now planning a book on Muhammad Ali Jinnah, right? As a Pakistani, I should know everything about it. But no, I'm just rereading Aisha Jalal and learning new things, because knowledge is textual and then experience comes and augments it. So that idea that somehow some people who don't live 100% in one country have no right to represent it, I think we can hope that they do a fair representation, or a representation that doesn't just pander the stereotypes. But beyond that, anyone has a right to write about anything. Okay, so there's another question that I don't see on my screen, but it's here, and I'll put it up as soon as it comes up. But I'll read it. And that's by Aisha. Diasporic writing as authentic, presenting the culture they are not currently living in. Do we need to redress the issue in their representation? Okay, so yeah, it's Aisha. Can we term diasporic writing as authentic, presenting the culture they are not currently living in? And that's the problem in this question, is the question of the authentic. Okay, so when we mention authentic, we are assuming that there is a certain authentic core to reality, right? But who can grasp the authentic? I mean, even if you could access the authentic core of a culture in the privacy of your thoughts, right? You will have to express it in language. And the moment you express it in language, first of all, you understand it in language. There is no understanding beyond language. So it's already mediated by your placing in the world as a human being who speaks and must use language. When you retrieve it and represent it, it's still in language. So the question that we should be asking is not of authenticity, right? If authenticity can be acquired simply through living in Pakistan or India, तो ये जो आप जितना पाकिस्तानी आज़ादी के ऊपर हिस्ट्री की किताबें पढ़ते हो, whatever you read, how much of authenticity is in there, right? What is the general idea of history of Pakistan movement that we get, right? Authentic, right? The Quaid-e-Azam single-handedly made Pakistan, right? That Fazl Haq from Bengal was one of his big supporters. Whereas if you actually read the historical text, he is the one who caused him the most problems. Similarly, the Punjabis were mostly unionists, right? So the authentic knowledge is based in discursive practices of what is being represented to us as authentic history. So can they be authentic? Probably not. But what is authenticity? Can someone do research on another culture and write a story about it? Yes. Now we can challenge the representation and say, hey, you don't have the lived experience in this culture. Yeah, we don't care how many books you read, but you can't really represent Pakistan well, right? But the question of authentic, I think, doesn't even apply, because authentic is a fiction that we ourselves create. आप लोगों में से, those of you from Pakistan especially, like who live in barrier town and DHAs, right? Let's say Rawalpindi, where I am from. Do you know where to find authenticity up? Do you know where Raja Bazaar is? Have you ever been there? Moti Bazaar, Raja Bazaar. Can you really represent Rawalpindi if you never get out of barrier town? And is there an authentic representation of Rawalpindi? these are some of the questions. So the question of the authentic, instead, I think we should ask the question of representation itself. What kind of representation is it, and is it plausible, right? And if not, why not? Okay, Mudassir, it is sad that the diasporic writers are sometimes sponsored to write about native countries negatively. That is not true representation of native culture and society. Well, I don't know if they are sponsored. I don't think so. Someone is going around saying, we'll give you $100,000 if you write a terrible story about Pakistan. Because already there are plenty of terrible stories about Pakistan in the media. That stereotype already exists. Now, what is happening is that these people, and that was my argument in those two articles that was so, violently misquoted by this Pakistani writer. My argument was that no matter what subject do these writers, Indians, Pakistanis, Bengalis, writers from Africa, they write about their culture, right? It doesn't hit a vacuum, right? That first of all, the topics, as Ijaz Ahmed famously pointed out in his book, are already overdetermined, what the metropolitan market wants, right? So what does it want? Like the stereotype of India and Pakistan, is like there should be a dictator in there, some big landlord, some kinds of atrocities being committed because that sells, right? So already the topics are overdetermined by the demands of the metropolitan market, by the publishers, right? It's very rare that you can come up and say, hey, I'm going to write a story about a city of Lahore and its historical places and this young man who walks around there. Joyce can write that about Dublin, but if you write it about Lahore, how many publishers will be interested in it? Not many. So that overdetermination is already there. And then my point has always been that what we write, it doesn't necessarily have to sugarcoat the reality. Now, look, in India, Pakistan, the native languages have a rich traditions of cultural critique, poets, writers. But to keep in mind that whatever you are representing in a novel about Pakistan, about Bangladesh, about India, shouldn't just play into those stereotypes. That story must be complicated, right? Because as Said would say, Edward Said, that there is a lot going on in the Middle East other than the, terrorists and bombs. Can we tell their stories? And why must we tell those stories? My argument in that article that there should be something positive and salutary, which this person absolutely reduced to Masood Raja, saying that all the story. No, my point was that can we get complex characters, right, who are good, who represent the best of that culture, because there are people like that, right, and mix them up with landlords and bad politicians, so that a Western reader reading over here, so that the novel or the short story doesn't just fortify their previously held stereotype about India and Pakistan, but rather complicates it. So, yes, I don't think so. People are like going around paying money to these authors, but so much of the choices that they make are overdetermined. And maybe they should be aware of that, right? Okay, so what is the difference between diaspora and transnationalism? So obvious difference is that you can be transnational whether you live in diaspora or not. So let's say you live in Pakistan or India or in Bangladesh, Assam, Nigeria. Your thought, your writing can be transnational if you're connected beyond the nation to anyone else in your literary studies, in your scholarship. You do not have to go there and live there to be transnational, because it's a state of mind, right? Diaspora is different from transnationalism because it involves actually physically moving from one place and making a life in another. So there is a physical movement, either forced or voluntary, involved in diaspora. Isn't there a danger of appropriation from the diaspora authors? Yes and no. I mean, appropriation to what cause? I mean, first, one thing that we absolutely cannot give into is that no one has the right to represent another culture. Everyone has the right to write about whatever they want. Now, if they appropriate certain tropes of Pakistani culture or Indian cultures, fine. They have a right to do so as authors, right? The problem is the question of representation, right? What are they representing? What are they choosing to represent? And what are the implications of that? Even then, they have the right to that. I believe in that kind of freedom of expression. So my example is when I wrote this essay about the Granta issue, the opening story in it is called Laila in, I think, Laila in Wilderness, right? Which is a beautiful love story, right? And I'm going to this question of appropriation. I'm forgetting the name of the author. But the story becomes problematic because while of course, there are already inconsistencies in the story, like philosophical, that a Pakistani reader would pick up like this, but for a Western reader, it doesn't make sense unless they've done their research. But the main problem was that the place is not named. So the story is happening at this amorphous place in Pakistan. Most of the people in the story are not named. And then the plot is driven through the most atrocious acts that you can represent. So by not giving the story a physical habitus, what happens to a reader here is that when they plot the story, they are not plotting it, let's say, in Faisalabad or in Jamshoro. They are plotting it on Pakistan, right? And then it is already picking up different tropes that people already associate with Pakistan, with India, with Islam. And it's playing with those tropes. So what the story then is doing is normalizing those tropes because they are coming now from a cultural insider, right? But also making it more expansive by not locating it at a certain physical place or habitus. So my point was that because of those formalistic choices, not just the content, the story, if uncritically read, will make the entire country of Pakistan a place where all these things can happen. Now, another thing that is emerging out of these authors, which is I find really troubling, is that if you read the Amazon reviews, and the reason I go to Amazon reviews is because these are not contrived. These are not by scholars or writers. These are everyday people who picked up a book and read it, right? And those are the opinions we want to check, right? And what came across in the reviews about Granta issue was this idea of Pakistan, as if the Pakistan is this dark and destructive place where creativity is dead and no culture exists. And somehow these 16 authors miraculously have survived that and can actually write on the world level. So the writers themselves become an emblem of, oh, yeah, Pakistan has a hope because these 12 people can write good stories. So they become the sign, which is good. I mean, if people respect them. But you know what I'm trying to say, that despite all the failures and all that, Pakistan can still produce these good stories by these 12 people. So even their success is juxtaposed against a dying or troubled culture. And I think there is a problem with that I see, which troubles me, right? So that's why my stance is, yeah, people have a right to express whatever they want, but people are also grounded in the politics of their cultural identity, their diasporic identity, and there are certain responsibilities of that. And that question of representation is huge, right? Who represents whom and how, right? That is the fight we are fighting right now in American streets, right? And so to claim a certain degree of poetic license without political implications, and I think is irresponsible. Right? Okay, can lead, okay, so can diaspora literature lead to misrepresentation? Yes, of course, I just talked about it. What I would not add to it is intentionality. What I'm saying is, I don't think that authors would intentionally do that to market their work, but it is overdetermined, right? And the misrepresentation isn't in a sense that they see something and then misrepresent it. No, because what we see and experience is also discursively produced, but misrepresentation in a sense that by picking up topics that are already troubling topics and are merged with the stereotype of that culture and reinforcing them, the misrepresentation then is that certain tropes then become the most important tropes through which the metropolitan readers will then see any of the cultures that the diaspora authors are trying to represent. And that's what I find troubling. Okay, Sajjad. Sir, Fatima Bhutto in The Shadow of the Crescent Moon misrepresented the tribal woman wearing jeans and driving bikes in the setting of North Waziristan. What can be the agenda behind? I don't know. Right? I like her work. I haven't read this particular work. But if she's doing it, I mean, stylistically, it becomes very obvious that, it's a play, right? Maybe she's imagining a thing. Otherwise, I have no problem women wearing jeans and riding motorcycles, right? In any society, Islamic or not, I don't care what women wear and what they do. They should have the absolute right to do so. And this is not just my opinion. This is a scholarly opinion by leading Muslim scholars, including Maulana Mumtaz Ali, whose book I have from 1898, Haqooq-e-Niswa. This whole idea, and this is slightly off the topic, that women are responsible for men's virtue. I mean, it's a baseless, stupid idea. Because if men are virtuous, it shouldn't really matter how the women are dressed and how they behave. They are individual, autonomous human beings, will be judged as individual, autonomous human beings if you believe in Day of Judgment. There is no stipulation in the Quran or in the Sunnah or in the Hadith where it says that when women go up there in front of God Almighty, they will be called, oh, you are so-and-so's wife, and he will answer for you. No, they will answer for their own actions. And if they do that, that means they are fully realized human beings, responsible for their own acts, and hence have full rights as men. And it doesn't really matter what they wear. Because if men are good, nice Muslim men, why should they even care what women wear? But this is besides the point. But I don't know if her representation is playful, if it is jarring. I would, sometimes it's okay to challenge the basic assumptions of your own culture. We do need critical works. My point is that playing with tropes that already are established in the metropolitan cultures about the cultures of the global periphery, that representing them ipso facto as such authenticates them, and that is dangerous. Other than that, a writer has the absolute right to play with any reality and make it, mock it, make it into a farce. I mean, that's the critical license they have, and we should be able to live with that. Okay, Chandra. Diaspora writing appears to be Orientalism internalized by middle-class elite. Okay, that's a really good point. And there has been a lot of stuff coming out of Pakistan. I'm not sure about India, where they talk about neo-Orientalism. And I've always maintained that neo-Orientalism is not possible if you have read your Said carefully, because Orientalism is a discourse. It's a larger discourse which overdetermines our action. We could say that it is kind of an exoticization, right? Which what they have internalized maybe is not Orientalism, but these idea of the post-colonial exotic, right? And so if they have internalized it, yeah, like if you are from India living in Dallas, right, and your experience of India is only through Bollywood, right, then your view of India is based in that, right? Which is a projected, represented reality. And if you internalize that, then that is the logic you will take to your writing about India, right? So I would say what they internalize is a certain representation of India, which they might have received in an uncomplicated manner. And if they represent it as a reality, then there is something wrong with it. If they do it playfully, play with the actual playfulness of the Bollywood representation, then that becomes something smarter and I think more intelligent. But I would say that I think sometimes these decisions are not even conscious, because the power of the metropolitan culture, its expectations, being successful in it, standing out as an author is such a powerful thing that you are already, let's say if you want to write a virtuoso story, right, which deals with a topic that is kind of taboo, so you might end up picking something that appeals to you, which is a great story, but which might end up, in terms of representation, perpetuating some kind of already existing myth about a culture. So I keep going back to Granta special issue, Mohsen Hamid's story in that. It's a beautifully written story, right? But what is the story about? You are in the mind of a hostage who is about to be beheaded by a terrorist organization, right? As a story, it's beautifully written, beautifully rendered until the last climactic moment. Right? But if you are given a chance to contribute a story about Pakistan in a special issue called Granta's special issue on Pakistani literature in English, right? Aren't there like any other topics that you could choose, right? Because you're already playing in this trope, in this cultural stereotype of Pakistan, where if you are a Westerner and you go there, you'll be abducted and beheaded. I'm still not saying that he doesn't have the right to that story. What I'm saying is, what determines that topic, right? Because there is a certain degree of overdetermination going on. From the point of view of personal attempt at writing a virtuosic story, a really brilliant story, to the theme, right, which is kind of jarring and all that. But overall, how would that story be received? What are the peripheral implications of that for a reader? So like, let's say I decide to create a course on Pakistani fiction in English, and for ease, I pick up the Granta's special issue. Now, I am Masood Raja, right? I speak 7 languages. I live in more than one culture. Maybe I can teach it with a certain degree of sophistication, with my experience, with my training, where that story or other stories are not just read as a total representation of an entire culture. But think about someone who's not trained as a post-colonialist, who doesn't know much about life in Pakistan, either textually or experientially, right? How would that person teach that story? If they just do the analysis, the technical analysis of the story will still, in terms of pedagogy, instill within the uncritical reader this idea that Pakistan is a place where people usually, if they're Westerns, they get beheaded. That's the danger that I'm talking about. Right? Okay, so these are some really good questions. But I hope you're getting from my explanations of it is that it's very hard, to have like a clear, articulated stances on these things. Now, some of you are interacting with me from India, some of you are interacting with me from Pakistan, And I'm not sure if our Moroccan friend is here today or not, but we all come from a colonial educational system, right? Even if you've gone to private schools. And what is sort of the essence of that? I mean, that's why I always tell Indians and Pakistanis, if you just sat down together and talked to each other what you have to study in your college classes and how it is taught, you guys would be the best friends, because it's kind of the similar experience. And I'm generalizing here, I know. So the way we are taught is that we pick up a short story and the teacher comes in and says, here is what it means, right? And all we do then, that's what I was at least expected to do in my education in Pakistan, is that either memorize the analysis of the story or just reproduce whatever the teacher gave you, right? Now, if we come from that kind of educational background, we like precise answers, right? We like a beginning, a middle, and a conclusion, and then say, this is what it means. And that's what we expect of philosophical terms and theoretical terms as well. The problem is that there are no neat conclusions about these concepts. There are no singular opinions. And the only difference I think that we can make as people, as scholars, is to know that my stance on it is provisional. Given new set of information, it can change, or that my stance on a certain concept such as the diaspora is based in my politics, based in my location, based in my understanding of it, but that is based in that, right? There is no like precise understanding of what diaspora literature ought to be, what it must do, what it must not do, because none of that experience is unmediated. It is governed by our politics. It is governed by our culture, our assumptions, our priorities. So keep that in mind. Okay, let's see. Chandra. Okay, so let's go to Soham. What's your take on partition literature? That's a really interesting question. So the thing with partition literature is it is categorized in so many different areas. So it is categorized in trauma studies on both sides, right? It is also categorized in kind of nationalistic narratives. And then like the biggest author that I know close to me here, she lives in Houston, for good partition novels is Bapsi Sidhwa, right? Whose novel Cracking India I've taught. So I think in terms of diaspora authors, it will depend. I mean, where do they live? And the experience of the partition is also mediated through, first of all, their family experiences, but which ethnic group did they come from? Which religious group did they come from? But by and large, what I've noticed in the partition literature, even like Khushwant Singh's, Train to Pakistan, is that the careful authors, there's always a critique of how the British handled it. But mostly, even Manto, the stories are mostly about how these communities that had lived together for centuries, how could they turn on each other and commit the kind of atrocities that they committed? And I think that's what kind of is foregrounded in that. Now, if the author is located in the diaspora, yes, it would still be partition literature like Bapsi Sidhwaji's book, but it will still also be a partition book. Okay, this is really good. As the diasporic writer sitting far away from its indigenous part of the world, it doesn't become the voices from the periphery. Yes and no. Okay. No one claims to say that I represent India or Pakistan. So we can't even assign them that role. Any author, even if they are living in Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, or Africa, Nigeria. I don't even think they are claiming to be the voices of their native country. But what role is assigned to them in literary classes in terms of representation is the role of this person who knows something more than you and me about that culture, who has either researched, gone and visited there, or lived there, right? So the degree of experience can be different. If you are a first generation diasporic author, chances are that a lot of your writing would incorporate the experience of immigration itself and its struggles because you moved here. It doesn't matter how long you've lived in New York or Dallas, right? But that experience is part of you. If you are someone who is a second generation diasporic authors, the novel or the writing could be about your experience as an outsider while living inside a metropolitan culture, and then maybe reconnecting with where your parents come from, right? I don't think so we should assign any of these authors, diasporic or post-colonial, this idea that they can represent an entire culture. I mean, that term, burden of representation, right? It comes from Kobina Mercer, his book, Welcome to the Jungle. And it's very peculiar to minority identities. What he says is, and he gives the reference of the first Black arts exhibition that was held in England. And what he realized was that when people from the African community, Caribbean community went to the exhibit, no one was happy because their whole idea was this doesn't represent me, so-and-so is not represented, such and such area is not represented. And what he realized was that because of their minority experience, they expected the work of arts put together in a gallery to carry the entire burden of those cultures, which no work of art can absolutely do. And the dominant group never expects that. I mean, Philip Roth can write all his novels set in New York, and no one will come and say, well, what about the South? What about Atlanta? No, it's accepted that you can write a novel of a city. You know, Joyce can write a novel about Dublin, right? One man walking around Dublin, and it can become a classic, right? But in the minority communities, there is always this expectation. There are anxieties about representation. There are then anxieties about, you know, what about that? You didn't write about that. Like I, as a scholar, have done that, right? So always remind yourself, no one carry the burden of representation of an entire culture or entire country. There is no authentic representation because authenticity is discursively produced, right? Everyone has a positionality in their life. Sometimes we can shift it and we come from there. Now, what we can challenge these authors or any author is not about the authenticity, but about, hey, guys, I think you didn't understand this aspect well, you should do better research. So I think challenging people on the question of representation is always better. Not necessarily that you didn't represent everything, but that what you represented can be construed as such and is based on this assumption which is wrong, instead of saying you have no authentic knowledge of this culture. And I think that would be a more subtle and more complicated approach to question of representation by diasporic authors. As I already said, I don't care where they are from, where they live, or what they choose to write about. If they have done their research, fine, because there is also something else at play when we question someone's right to represent someone, and that is the idea of point of view, standpoint identity, that I have to be this in order to write about that. I think as a human being, you can go beyond that, right? Maybe I was advising a student last semester who's writing a dissertation in philosophy about white settler colonialism. And he is relying on the Native American tradition for that. So my only cautionary note to him was, because he's Caucasian and he's male. That was that I said, look, consider this a sacred territory. You are entering a body of knowledge which is the property of this community, right? Choctaw community. You're entering it as a Caucasian male. Don't go in there telling them that you can explain things better. Don't claim to know their culture intimately and authentically, but enter with a humility as a scholar and say, this is what I have learned from the tribal elders. I don't plan to speak for them because they can speak for themselves, but I would like to speak in solidarity with them, right? And I think if we follow the same principle, then it shouldn't matter who you are, especially in imaginative writing and what you're writing about. Okay, let me go to Chandra again. It is curious that bulk of diaspora literature is in the form of novels and much less on poetry. If this is a market conditioning, then its creative moorings will be suspect. I don't think so. It's a marketing condition. I think it's a poetry. I mean, of course, there are poets who have become prominent even in translation. But in terms of, if you look at a lot of these young authors from Canada and America, you know, if they are diasporic, if they are going into creative writing programs, poetry is big, right? But if you look at what people idealize, of course, everyone is writing a novel. They want to write a novel because novel has the biggest market, but also because it's the most expensive form of writing, right? Especially if your idea is to capture stories or connect with your native culture or your parents' native culture through imagination. But you're right, by and large, you know, I mean, of course, there are poets as well. I mean, I would consider Naomi Shihab Nye, you know, a post-colonialist, but also a diasporic author. Agha Shahid Ali wrote in English as well as translated literature from Urdu. But you're right, there aren't a lot of poets or even playwrights. There are movie script writers and producers, right? But I wouldn't say that it's, you know, like I don't want to see any intended conspiracies behind these. I think there are over-determining factors which decide what genre you write in. And since novel is the most expensive genre, and also you can make more money, you know, if you write novels and they become successful. And if that is your concern as a writer, then the novel or even a collection of short stories becomes prominent. Okay, so thank you so much. You've been continuously nourishing the. Oh, cool. Thank you so much. And, you know, we are like coming up about an hour now. And as I always say, that I am not doing any of you a favor. Okay. These exchanges with you every week are actually really invigorating for me too, because, you know, I get to talk to people from all over the world, share my ideas, and, you know, read your questions and have this exchange. So please never think that I am doing you a favor. Actually, you all, through your energy, you know, especially in this Corona environment, are you know, really giving me a lot of good spiritual energy. So I think it's okay if we stop here. I don't see any more questions, and it's been about an hour that we've been talking to each other. So thank you so much for joining me today. And as always, I will announce the next week's topic through the channel. I would also like to request you to subscribe if you haven't, and share the content of the channel with others so that more people can benefit from it. Use it in your classes. And as always, if you have any suggestions, post them, you know, in the comments. So that's all from today. And I'm going to sign off now. And as always, thank you so much, and peace and love.